August 21, 1863, armed horsemen rode into Lawrence, Kansas and turned the streets into a killing ground that scarred everyone who survived and hardened men like Cole Younger for the rest of their lives. For years before that morning, the Missouri and Kansas border had been sliding toward this kind of violence. Farms in Jackson County, Clay County, and the scattered settlements along the state line carried scars from raids even before the Civil War officially started. Pro-slavery families and anti-slavery settlers had fought over fields, barns, and crossroads towns. By the early 1860s, people in places like Westport, Independence, Liberty, and the smaller farm communities had learned to sleep with guns close at hand. Patrols of Union militia, Kansas Jayhawkers, and pro-Confederate bushwhackers all moved through the same dirt roads, each side convinced that the civilians who claimed to be neutral were hiding ammunition or information for the enemy. The Younger family in Jackson County tried to hold on to ordinary life while this pressure mounted. Henry Washington Younger, a prosperous farmer and businessman, leaned toward the Union, hoping that loyalty would protect his property and his large household. His son Thomas Coleman, called Cole, watched that hope fail. A Union soldier from Kansas shot Henry Younger and left him dying, and other Unionists harassed the family. Cole's sister was assaulted and the Younger home was burned. The destruction of the farm and the humiliation of his family tore away any belief that staying out of the fight could keep them safe. Cole Younger left the farm as a teenager and rode toward the guerrilla bands that were gathering in the woods and hollows along the Missouri border. By 1862, Cole Younger had joined the irregulars under William Clark Quantrill. In those camps, he met seasoned fighters from earlier skirmishes and men like Frank James, another young Missourian who had stepped away from regular Confederate service and slipped into the Shadow War in western Missouri. The guerrilla life that Quantrill led looked nothing like the ordered lines of soldiers described in drill manuals. His riders slept in small groups at isolated farms or in wooded ravines, saddled their horses before dawn, and moved with constant secrecy. They relied on local sympathizers to feed them, hide them, and pass messages, and they repaid that support with ruthless attacks on patrols and towns marked as enemies. Quantrill's men developed a style of fighting that fit the broken landscape of western Missouri. They learned every creek bed, ridge, and wagon road that could carry a small group out of sight within minutes. Each rider carried multiple Colt revolvers in his belt and on his saddle, using them at close range before an enemy could reload a single long gun. They used disguises, rode under captured Union flags, and chose ambush sites where narrow roads forced soldiers into tight formations. Those methods aimed to leave a patrol dead or scattered within a few minutes and then send the guerrillas racing away along pre-planned escape paths while alarmed civilians were still trying to understand what had happened. Cole Younger fit into this world quickly. He knew the farms and back roads of Jackson County and beyond, and he brought a personal hunger for revenge that matched the bitterness of men who had lost families to Jayhawker raids. When Quantrill planned strikes, Cole joined scouting rides that measured distances between river crossings, counted buildings in small towns, and searched for gaps in local defenses. He helped gather information from sympathizers in border communities, heard lists of men accused of betraying neighbors to Union officers, and watched those names turn into targets. The border war fed on itself. Union commanders tried to break the guerrilla network by arresting relatives of bushwhackers. Women and children connected to known irregulars were jailed or driven from their homes. One of the worst incidents struck families tied to Quantrill's men when a makeshift women's prison in Kansas City collapsed, killing and maiming several young women who were sisters or cousins of guerrillas. News of that collapse spread through the camps and hardened their desire for retaliation. Men like Cole Younger and his comrades stopped thinking of the conflict as a war between armies. In their eyes, it had become a series of personal scores to settle with blood. Lawrence became the clearest symbol of that anger. The Kansas town had long been a base for anti-slavery activists and for Jayhawker leaders who had raided into Missouri. By August of 1863, Quantrill's scouts reported that Lawrence seemed lightly defended. The guerrilla leader gathered about 300 riders, including Cole Younger and other Missourians who had seen their families driven from their homes. Before dawn on August 21st, the column moved toward the town, keeping to side roads to avoid early warning. When the riders reached Lawrence after sunrise, they split into smaller detachments and entered from different directions. Residents first saw dust and heard hoofbeats, then realized that armed men were filling the streets. The guerrillas rode past shops and homes, calling out names of known targets. Men were pulled from beds or dragged into yards and shot. Business offices and newspaper buildings were set on fire. Churches, hotels, and private houses burned. By the end of the raid, about 200 males, including teenage boys and elderly men, lay dead among the ruins. Cole Younger and the other guerrillas watched buildings collapse and listened to the cries of surviving families as they rode away from the blazing town. The Lawrence raid did not break the Union presence in Kansas, but it transformed how federal authorities treated guerrillas in Missouri. Union General Thomas Ewing issued an order that forced civilians out of several Missouri counties along the Kansas line. Entire neighborhoods were emptied. Homes, barns, and crops were destroyed to deny bushwhackers food and shelter. Families like the Youngers had already experienced personal attacks, but now thousands of people, including many who had tried to avoid taking sides, were uprooted. The landscape that Cole Younger and Frank James rode through after Lawrence looked stripped and abandoned, with chimneys standing where farmhouses had been and fields going to waste. Union militia and Kansas Jayhawkers responded to every sign of guerrilla activity with raids of their own. Riders wearing blue uniforms or civilian clothes swept into suspected neighborhoods, demanding information and searching for hidden men and weapons. In many places, the distinction between military action and personal revenge disappeared. Some raiders took livestock, burned buildings, and beat or killed civilians who had no direct connection to Quantrill's men. Those acts reinforced the belief among guerrillas that the war justified any strike against their enemies, and that mercy only invited more attacks later. While Cole Younger and Frank James spent these years in the irregular war, Jesse James was still a teenager on the family farm in Clay County. Jesse had been born in 1847, the son of Baptist minister and farmer Robert James and his wife Zerelda, in a part of Missouri settled heavily by people from Kentucky and Tennessee. The James family owned enslaved people and worked a sizable farm. After Robert James died in California when Jesse was very young, Zerelda struggled to hold the household together as tensions rose. By the time full war reached Missouri, Frank James had already taken up arms, and the farm at Kearney sat in a region where Union patrols and militia units watched former Confederate families with deep suspicion. Frank James initially fought with pro-Confederate forces in more conventional service, but he gravitated toward the bushwhackers who moved through the familiar woods and ravines of western Missouri. Jesse stayed at home for a time, helping with work on the farm while his older brother was away, and the conflict grew harsher around them. As Union forces tried to clamp down on guerrillas, the James home, like many others marked as Southern in sympathy, faced searches and rough treatment far beyond simple inspection. These encounters left emotional scars and helped push Jesse toward the same violent path that had already claimed his brother. By 1864, Jesse James had recovered from earlier wounds and joined the group led by William T. Anderson, the guerrilla whose brutality earned him the nickname Bloody Bill. Anderson's men mirrored and in some ways surpassed Quantrill's riders in their willingness to use terror. Jesse joined them as a 16-year-old whose teenage years had been shaped by raids, reprisals, and stories of dead relatives and neighbors. Under Anderson's guidance, He learned to fire revolvers rapidly from the saddle, to strike a target at arm's length without hesitation, and to ride away before organized resistance could form. On September 27, 1864, Anderson led about 80 guerrillas into the small town of Centralia, Missouri. Jesse James rode among them. The group entered Centralia, looted supplies and liquor, and created chaos that drew attention all along the rail line. A train approached while the guerrillas were in town. Anderson's men halted it, forced the passengers out, and discovered that 24 off-duty Union soldiers were among them. The guerrillas separated the soldiers from civilians and lined them up beside the tracks. When one volunteer stepped forward expecting to die in place of the others, the guerrillas spared him and instead shot the entire line of unarmed soldiers. The massacre left their bodies on the ground beside the still smoking locomotive. Later that day, a larger Union force set out from the region to hunt down Anderson's band. Anderson and his men prepared an ambush near Centralia. They chose ground that favored mounted pistol fighters over cavalry trained to use long guns. As the Union troops advanced, the guerrillas waited, then charged through tall grass and brush, firing revolvers at close distance into blue-clad riders who were struggling to form a line. The result was another slaughter. Around 150 Union soldiers died in the encounter, many killed at point-blank range. Jesse James and the other guerrillas saw men fall from saddles, heard panicked shouts from horses and riders, and witnessed a level of bloodshed that few conventional soldiers experienced in such compressed time. The Lawrence and Centralia actions stood out even in a war filled with brutality. They also showed young fighters like Cole Younger, Frank James, and Jesse James that the combination of surprise, intimate local knowledge, and rapid gunfire could destroy larger, better-equipped forces. Guerrillas who survived these raids believed that quick, violent action could achieve results that months of marching and formal battles could not. They also came to accept civilian deaths as a routine cost of their war, since towns and farms were seen as part of the enemy's support network. As 1864 wore on, the leadership structure of the guerrilla war fell apart. Quantrill's authority weakened, and his riders split into smaller bands. Some followed Anderson, whose career ended when Union troops killed him in late 1864. Others drifted toward different leaders or tried to disappear into rural communities. Yet the core group of hardened fighters remained in the region, many of them unable or unwilling to surrender. Cole Younger stayed in the field, shifting between groups that were remnants of the old Quantrill organization. Frank James moved in the same circles, still attached to the irregular cause even as the Confederate national effort faded. By the spring of 1865, the Confederacy collapsed. Formal armies surrendered, officers stacked weapons, and soldiers accepted paroles. In Missouri, the end of official war did not instantly remove the danger. Former guerrillas faced angry Unionists, new state laws, and the practical problem of what to do with skills that had nothing to do with farming or shopkeeping. Missouri adopted a harsh constitution that barred former Confederates from voting, holding public office, or preaching. Men like Cole Younger returned to counties where civil government existed on paper, but resentment ruled daily life. Neighborhoods remembered who had ridden with which side, who had informed on whom, and whose barns had been burned by what uniform. Cole Younger tried to come back into that society with his name already linked to raids and killings. His father was gone, his family home damaged or destroyed, and Unionist officials held power in Jackson County and surrounding areas. Authorities who had fought guerrillas during the war did not suddenly view them as neighbors. Younger lived under the constant possibility of arrest or reprisal. The same was true for Frank James and other former irregulars whose war records were known. Each appearance in a town or at a public gathering brought the risk that someone might point them out as criminals rather than soldiers. Some former bushwhackers attempted to leave Missouri or to bury their pasts by changing names and locations. Others stayed rooted to the same hills and farms, gathering at county fairs, horse races, and saloons where men traded stories of past raids and complained about the new political order. Among those who refused to give up armed resistance, Archie Clement stood out. He had ridden with Quantrill and continued violent acts after the war, targeting Reconstruction authorities and symbolizing a refusal to accept defeat. His small group of riders kept alive the habits of sudden attacks, masked faces, and getaways that had defined the guerrilla years. Jesse and Frank James emerged from the war physically marked and emotionally shaped by events like Centralia, and they rejoined a circle of former comrades that included Cole Younger and his brothers. These men shared a language, a set of tactics, and a deep belief that the Union victory had been achieved by trampling their homes and families. Peace did not feel like justice. Civilian law now came from the same authorities they had spent years trying to destroy. To them, the government in Jefferson City and the local sheriffs who enforced new rules looked like extensions of the enemy patrols they had ambushed along country roads. In this tense atmosphere, with farms damaged, legitimate opportunities limited, and weapons still close at hand, talk among certain ex-guerrillas shifted from politics to money. The skills they possessed pointed toward a specific kind of crime. They knew how to scout targets, plan quick strikes, control crowds with pistols, and escape before organized resistance formed. Banks, which held concentrated wealth behind relatively thin walls, appeared as vulnerable as any wartime supply wagon or paymaster's chest. Outspoken men at these gatherings began to suggest that the same methods that had emptied federal wagons could be used to empty a vault. By late 1865 and early 1866, Western Missouri carried the uneasy feeling of a region that had never truly stepped out of war. Patrols had faded, but veterans with unresolved anger and little income remained. In cabins and back rooms, former guerrillas discussed how to carry their fight into the new era, no longer under a Confederate banner, but still aimed at the institutions they saw as enemies. When conversations turned from vague resentment to specific plans to attack a bank in Liberty, Missouri, the men who had ridden through Lawrence and Centralia were ready to apply their hard-earned skills in a new and deadly way. February 13, 1866, the Clay County Savings Association in Liberty, Missouri opened its front door as usual. While a group of former guerrillas rode toward the square with no intention of ever living quietly under the new peace. Liberty was a tidy county seat with brick storefronts and a modest bank built in 1859. Its federal-style walls meant to signal stability to farmers and merchants who brought in gold, paper notes, and bonds. Inside that afternoon, cashier Greenup Bird and his son William handled routine business. Ledgers sat open on the counter, a small iron safe stood in a corner, and the men behind the counter knew most customers by name. The war had ended less than a year earlier, but the town was trying to behave as if 4 years of raids and skirmishes had been left behind. Shortly after midday, 10 or a dozen mounted men appeared on the streets around the bank. They wore common clothes, some with their pistols hidden, some with revolvers visible on their belts, the way many Missourians still carried weapons. Several riders remained outside, letting their horses walk slowly near the front entrance while two pushed the bank door open and stepped inside. Greenup Bird and his son saw strangers instead of familiar depositors, one moving directly to the counter and the other watching the door. In a moment, the tone of the room shifted from routine to forced stillness as pistols came out and one of the men told Bird that this was a robbery. The cashier was ordered away from the window and struck with a pistol when he hesitated. Bird and his son were forced to open drawers and produce cash, coin, and registered bonds. The robbers knew what they wanted, not just loose currency, but the valuable paper that represented investments for citizens across Clay County. They made Bird and his son pack the haul into containers while other riders outside kept townspeople at a distance. Anyone who approached too close saw revolvers pointed in their direction and backed away. The robbery lasted only minutes. As the gang left the bank and swung into their saddles, they fired shots to warn away followers. A 17-year-old bystander named George Wymore stood near the Green Hotel, curious about the commotion. A bullet struck him as the riders pounded past. He fell in the street and died, an unintended victim who had nothing to do with war politics or guerrilla bands. The killers rode on without stopping. Within hours, a heavy snowstorm blew into Liberty, burying the tracks of their horses and defeating posses that tried to follow. The robbery stripped the bank of tens of thousands of dollars and left a dead boy, 2 beaten employees, and a stunned town that had thought the worst violence ended with Appomattox. The Liberty robbery became known as the first successful peacetime daylight bank robbery in the United States. Depositors learned that their savings were gone with no guarantee of recovery. The Clay County Savings Association eventually failed, and the building that had symbolized security became a reminder that armed men could walk into a bank at midday and destroy it. Locals heard the same names whispered behind the public statements, men like Archie Clement and Cole Younger, veterans of the border war who had simply shifted their skills from ambushing Union patrols to looting a vault. The message across Missouri was clear. The war had left behind armed bands who no longer took orders from any government. Other small towns soon discovered that Liberty had not been an isolated act. On May 22, 1867, riders descended on Richmond, Missouri, and entered the Hughes and Wasson Bank while others covered the street. Inside, staff were forced at gunpoint to hand over money. Outside, Mayor John Shaw and Deputy Sheriff Frank Griffin tried to intervene and were shot down along with Griffin's father when he rushed to his son's side. The gang left 3 local men dead on their own street, the kind of casualties that a battlefield report once listed under a regiment's name, now recorded only in county histories and family Bibles. Later that same year and into 1868, another robbery in Lexington and a series of violent incidents around Jackson County kept the region on edge. Newspapers and law officers began to group these events together in their minds, seeing a pattern in the timing and tactics. The robberies took place in daylight, at small financial houses whose guards and staff did not expect professional criminals. The attackers moved in numbers large enough to control a town square for a few minutes, then vanished along back roads that they knew from wartime scouting. Authorities pointed to familiar surnames from guerrilla days and described the robbers as the same men who had once ridden under Quantrill and Anderson. On March 20, 1868, attention shifted east to Russellville, Kentucky, where the Nimrod Long Banking Company stood on the town square. That Friday, business moved at a normal pace until several strangers walked in with pistols hidden beneath their coats. One man confronted banker Nimrod Long while others drove nervous employees toward the rear of the building. Long tried to resist and was shot in the head, the bullet grazing his scalp and knocking him to the floor. While he lay dazed but alive, the robbers forced clerks to fill wheat sacks with currency, coin, and other valuables. Outside, the rest of the gang kept people back with drawn guns. When the group rode away, firing into the air as they left town, a young man named Matt Owens chased after them with a rifle. One of the outlaws turned in the saddle and shot him in the side, leaving Owens wounded while the horses carried the raiders out of reach. The Russellville robbery showed that the network of former guerrillas now crossed state lines with ease. Authorities in Kentucky named Cole Younger and other Missourians among the suspects. In their view, the same men who had stripped Liberty and Richmond were now hitting banks in a border state that had tried to straddle neutrality during the war. Citizens in Russellville learned the same hard lesson as those in Liberty. A bank built on local capital could be emptied in minutes by men who never had accounts there, and the victim list could include anyone who stepped into the line of fire. By the early 1870s, the core group of outlaws had coalesced into what newspapers began to call the James and Younger Gang. Cole Jim and Bob Younger, Frank and Jesse James, and associates like John Jarrett and Arthur McCoy did not always ride together, but they shared information, safe houses, and methods. After a rest period on farms or in friendly towns, small teams formed up for specific jobs, rode hundreds of miles if necessary, and then scattered again. In Kentucky, Missouri, Iowa, and Arkansas, witnesses described similar scenes. Masked riders or barefaced gunmen appearing without warning, seizing a bank or a stage road, and vanishing as quickly as they had come. On June 3, 1871, a bank in Corydon, Iowa, was robbed by 4 men who matched the growing pattern. The following year, on April 29, 1872, another group struck the Bank of Columbia in Kentucky. Cashier R.A.C. Martin reached for a pistol and was shot dead, and Judge James Garnett, the bank president, took a wound that would cost him his hand years later. The robbers forced remaining staff to hand over money, then escaped into the countryside with local law officers trailing behind them on tired horses. To the towns they hit, these were personal tragedies. To observers tracking the pattern, the robberies marked the march of a single organization growing more confident in its abilities. Later in 1872, the gang extended its operations beyond traditional banks to an event that symbolized public prosperity. At the Kansas City Exposition, men armed with revolvers seized gate receipts and cash, clashing with staff and sending visitors scrambling. A stray bullet struck a young girl in the leg. She survived, but the image of a child wounded at a public fair underscored how broad the gang's reach had become. No longer confined to back roads or small campus-like squares, their attacks touched places families associated with celebration. Railroads soon felt the same shock that banks had experienced in Liberty and Russellville. On July 21, 1873, near Adair, Iowa, the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad became the target of the gang's first major train robbery. The outlaws removed spikes and loosened rails along a curve, intending to halt the train and force the express car to surrender its cargo. When the locomotive reached the tampered section, the engineer tried to brake, but the heavy engine left the track and rolled. Engineer John Rafferty died under the wreckage, while passengers stumbled out of the damaged cars. The gunmen went to work ordering men to hand over valuables and forcing railroad staff to open the express safe. They left with thousands of dollars and a dead railroader behind them, proof that trains moving through quiet farmland were no safer than remote banks. In January 1874, the gang hit stage lines in Louisiana and Arkansas, stopping coaches on lonely stretches of road near Arcadia and Malvern. Riders appeared from the brush, leveled guns at drivers and passengers, and demanded wallets, jewelry, and strongboxes. On some occasions, they handed small sums back to passengers who explained that they carried only a little money, a gesture that later supporters used to paint them as selective in their targets. To the passengers who saw pistols inches from their faces, the distinction had little meaning. They remembered being forced to stand in the road while strangers rifled through personal belongings and decided on the value of each life and item. That same month, the outlaws robbed an Iron Mountain Railroad train at Gads Hill, Missouri. They stopped the train, separated passengers, and searched for those who looked wealthy. Newspapers described the scene in detail, noting that the robbers allowed some travelers to keep small amounts of cash while stripping others of more valuable items. The attack sent a message to railroads and passengers alike. No schedule and no route was beyond reach. Railroad companies responded by hiring more guards and turning to private detective agencies for help in hunting the gang. The most determined of those agencies was the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Railroads and express companies hired Pinkerton operatives to follow leads on the James and Younger Gang, shadow their supporters, and infiltrate communities where they found shelter. Detectives like Lewis Lull and John Witcher tried to get close enough to collect evidence or capture members. Some of them died in the attempt. Lull was killed in a gunfight near Roscoe, Missouri, and Witcher was found shot by a rural road after making the mistake of discussing his plans too openly. Each dead detective hardened attitudes on both sides, turning what might have been a series of criminal investigations into a personal war between armed professionals and armed outlaws. On the night of January 26, 1875, that war reached the James family farm near Kearney, Missouri. Pinkerton operatives, acting on information that Jesse and Frank James might be visiting their mother, surrounded the farmhouse after dark. Accounts agree that an explosive device was thrown toward the house, landing near a room where Zerelda Samuel, her husband Dr. Reuben Samuel, and young Archie Samuel were gathered. The blast ripped through the structure. Archie was killed, and Zerelda's right arm was mangled so badly that doctors later amputated part of it. The incident enraged neighbors who already sympathized with the James brothers and convinced the gang that their enemies were willing to kill women and children to reach them. In the weeks that followed, a neighbor named Dan Askew, believed to have cooperated with detectives, was found shot dead near his property. The killing signaled that the gang would answer attacks on family with personal vengeance. For residents of Clay County, the cycle of violence that had begun before the Civil War now seemed to be repeating itself in a new form, with private detectives taking the place of Union patrols and outlaw riders reprising their guerrilla tactics. Despite the increased pressure, the robberies did not stop. On September 6, 1875, a bank in Huntington, West Virginia was held up by 4 men who fit the familiar pattern. And on July 6, 1876, 8 robbers halted a Missouri Pacific Railroad train near Otterville, Missouri, and took thousands of dollars from the express car. Each success raised the rewards on the gang's heads and spread their names farther through newspaper columns. Governors, sheriffs, and railroad officials read reports of the same surnames appearing from Kentucky to Iowa and from Missouri to West Virginia. In saloons and farmhouses, ordinary citizens did the same, some seeing the gang as dangerous criminals, others viewing them as stubborn holdouts against a Reconstruction order they despised. By early 1876, the James and younger men stood at a crossroads. Missouri and its neighboring states bristled with law officers prepared to chase them, private detectives willing to risk their lives, and informants ready to trade information for reward money. Banks and railroads in their home territory had hardened their defenses. Local sympathizers were under scrutiny. To keep operating, the outlaws needed a new hunting ground, a prosperous region where war scars were lighter, security habits were looser, and their faces were not yet familiar. As they studied maps and read reports of distant towns, their attention shifted north, toward a state of milling centers and college communities that few Missourians had ever visited. Late August 1876, 8 seasoned riders crossed into southern Minnesota looking for banks that had never yet heard the sound of their guns. They brought with them the habits of years on the run. Each man trusted his horse more than any landlord and carried several Colt revolvers hidden beneath dust coats or under plain clothing that would not draw notice. Their names in Missouri and the border states already sat on reward posters, so in Minnesota they introduced themselves as engineers measuring future rail lines, cattle buyers watching prices, or land seekers with money to invest. At desks in town hotels they signed false names in guest registers, then stepped out onto wooden sidewalks where no one yet knew what they had done elsewhere. Southern Minnesota in 1876 looked and sounded different from the counties the riders had left behind. Wheat, corn, and oats ran in straight rows away from white farmhouses and red barns. Many farm families had arrived from New England or from Europe in the previous decade. Swedish and Norwegian voices mixed with Yankee accents in shops and churches. Most young men had done their soldiering far from home and had come back to build mills, warehouses, and stores along new rail lines. They read about Jesse James and the younger brothers in newspapers the way they read about trouble in Texas as something that belonged to other regions. The gang paid close attention to that attitude. When they stayed at hotels in towns like St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Red Wing, they watched how people reacted to armed strangers. Minnesota men carried pistols less often than Missourians. A revolver on a belt drew looks but not alarm. That told the visitors that a group of well-dressed horsemen could move around almost anywhere without causing suspicion if they behaved politely. In parlors and dining rooms, they talked about crops, railroad expansion, and cattle prices while their eyes measured doorways, stairways, and the distance to the nearest alley. In St. Paul and Minneapolis, they walked into banks as ordinary callers. Clerks and tellers saw men in travel dusters ask routine questions about exchange rates and drafts. Behind the counters, employees counted notes for deposit, never guessing that the same hands had held pistols in Liberty, Russellville, and Adair. The Outlaws noted where safes stood, how high counters ran, and whether there were side doors near teller cages. They also counted their steps from front doors to spots where horses could wait. The big cities did not look right to them as final targets. Too many people filled the pavements and police walked regular beats. The gang wanted a town that carried enough money to make a raid worthwhile but did not expect organized violence. Maps and printed guides helped them narrow the field to a cluster of smaller towns to the south, strung along the Minnesota River and nearby rail lines. Names like St. Peter, Mankato, Lake Crystal, Madelia, St. Louis, James, Garden City, Janesville, Cordova, Waterville, Millersburg, Cannon City, and Northfield began to recur in their talk as they rode. One member of the band, William Chadwell, who often used the name Stiles, knew Rice County from earlier years. He had lived in that part of Minnesota before drifting back south, and now he sometimes rode ahead as a guide. He pointed out shortcuts from one settlement to another, described rivers that flooded in spring but ran low in late summer, and identified farms where travelers might find supper and a bed without raising questions. His knowledge helped the gang move without wandering, and it lent weight to his opinions about which towns looked promising. The riders did not enter these southern towns as one obvious group. Sometimes two men appeared together, claiming to be partners in a stock business. Sometimes 4 or 5 arrived within the same day but registered at separate hotels or boarding houses. On other days, they avoided main streets and turned into farmyards instead, asking for meals with the easy manner of men used to the road. Wherever they stopped, they paid in good cash, asked questions about roads and local banks, and listened closely to how residents described their own communities. They wanted to know where farmers took their deposits and which banks handled shipments from grain buyers and mill owners. By the end of August, their attention had fixed on Mankato, a growing town near a bend in the Minnesota River. It had more than one bank, busy streets, and a steady flow of money from trade along the river and new rail lines. The First National Bank of Mankato held deposits from merchants and farmers across a wide region, and its building sat near the center of town where a daylight raid could be staged. The gang's plan, formed after days of talk along the road and in hotel rooms, called for a strike there first, followed by other raids farther along their chosen line of travel. 5 of the Outlaws rode into Mankato on Saturday, September 2nd. Townspeople noticed their fine horses, good saddles, and confident riding. Some later said the strangers handled their animals like men who had been in the saddle since boyhood. The riders made purchases in several stores and took care to be remembered as decent paying customers. They also walked into the First National Bank and asked for change on a $50 note, watching as the teller handled cash and as clerks moved between desks, vault, and counter. That evening the men separated as they usually did. At least 4 took rooms in different hotels, so that no group would look large enough to draw curiosity in a single lobby. The 5th found lodging in another place across the river, a rough house known to harbor men who lived by theft and smuggling. There the talk ran to river levels and crops, but in a back room the visitors spoke with local hard cases about routes out of town, fords across creeks, and places where fast horses could be changed for fresh animals if pursuit grew too close. The presence of the strangers did not go unnoticed. Someone in Mankato recognized Jesse James and quietly told local authorities that a Missouri outlaw might be in town. Police took the warning seriously enough to keep the men under observation for several hours, and word reached some of the bank staff that criminals could be nearby. The townspeople still did not expect a daylight assault on the main bank, but the idea that dangerous men might be watching the place made them more alert than usual. On Monday, September 4th, the 5 riders saddled up and prepared to put their plan into action. They had chosen the middle of the day when bank employees would be fewer and when farmers who had finished morning chores might be back at home. The men rode toward the First National Bank, intending to step inside, control the staff at gunpoint, and empty drawers and vault space before anyone could react. As they passed along the street in front of the bank, they saw more people than expected on the sidewalks. A meeting of the town's Board of Trade had drawn merchants and farmers into the business district, and repairs on a building had brought carpenters and laborers to the same block. Looking from the saddle, the outlaws saw clusters of men standing near the bank and saw one of them gesture while looking in their direction. To riders whose lives depended on reading danger early, that motion looked like an alarm being raised. They kept going, telling themselves that they could circle back later when the street was quieter. When they made another approach toward the bank, the scene had not changed much. There were still knots of men on the sidewalk, still tools clattering on scaffolding, still faces turned toward the street. One man again seemed to point them out to another. The riders could not know that the man was commenting on the quality of their horses, not on their identities. All they saw was the possibility of a crowd ready to resist. No one in Mankato had actually guessed what the strangers intended. The extra people near the bank that day were there because of ordinary business. Yet the conditions that would have made a bank raid more complicated also convinced the gang that the town was on guard. A daylight robbery that stalled at the door would leave them trapped in a street full of witnesses and potential gunmen, and a failed attempt in a town that size could throw all of Minnesota into alarm before they even reached another target. They left Mankato sooner than planned, pushing their horses away from town and dropping the idea of returning. The decision did not come easy. Mankato had looked promising on paper and in their own scouting, but patience could be as important as boldness. As they rode east toward Janesville that evening, they talked through alternatives. Minnesota still seemed to hold the kind of bank they wanted, one that was rich enough to be worth the risk yet small, enough to be vulnerable. While the riders left Mankato frustrated, events in Northfield on that same Monday added a quiet piece to the story. In the First National Bank of Northfield, bookkeeper and acting cashier Joseph Lee Haywood discussed recent robberies with his employer. During that talk, his employer asked whether, under the pressure of an armed attack, he would open the safe to save his life. Haywood answered that he did not think he would. He understood what the loss of the bank's cash could do to depositors and to the town that depended on their savings. His calm reply stayed with the men who heard it, though no one yet imagined how soon that conviction would be tested. The gang's thoughts were turning toward Northfield at the same time, though for different reasons. As they moved through Janesville, Cordova, and other small settlements east and north of Mankato over the next 2 days, they kept studying maps and listening to local talk. Northfield stood out as a place where farm wealth, mill power, and college money came together. It sat on the Cannon River, with mills that drew power from the current and warehouses that handled grain from the surrounding country. Two colleges, Carleton and St. Olaf, brought students, faculty, and outside funds into town. Merchants handled steady trade from farmers who hauled produce in wagons over dirt roads to the depot and stores. Chadwell, the writer who knew Rice County, spoke well of the roads leading into Northfield from the southwest and from the south. He described how a group of horsemen could approach on separate routes, reach nearby villages like Millersburg and Cannon City without attracting much notice, and then converge on the town the next day. He also knew that the countryside to the west and south of Northfield held stretches of timber, sloughs, and side roads that could complicate a chase if they needed to escape toward the prairies. On Tuesday night, the band bedded down near Cordova, using barns and sheds that cooperative farmers offered. They unsaddled their horses, rubbed them down, and checked cinches, stirrups, and straps for wear. In low voices, they argued over details. Some argued for a return to Missouri where they knew every ridge and creek bed. Others insisted that the trouble stirred by recent attacks on their families made that region too hot for a large move. Minnesota, with its untested banks and relaxed attitudes toward armed strangers, still looked like the most favorable place for a major robbery. By Wednesday evening, September 6th, they had taken positions that would put them within reach of Northfield the next morning. Part of the band stayed in Millersburg, about 11 miles west of town, where they could claim to be cattle buyers moving along country roads. The rest stayed in Cannon City, roughly 10 miles south, another small settlement whose people did not yet understand that a gang of outlaws was sleeping under their roofs or in their barns. In both places, the riders ate big suppers, fed their horses, and kept their weapons and real plans out of sight. Farms in that region saw travelers often enough that a group of strangers did not automatically trigger panic. Some hosts thought the men were speculators from farther south, eyeing land prices in the state's growing rail network. Others supposed they were drovers or horse traders impressed by their mounts and gear. A few noticed that the visitors kept their pistols close even when seated at table. But politeness and the need to keep business flowing discouraged blunt questions. That night, in dim lamplight, the gang settled the last points of their plan. They would ride into Northfield in separate detachments, meeting west of town and then moving in such a way that no one would see all 8 of them together until the final moments. 3 men would be assigned to go inside the First National Bank once they were sure the town square looked manageable. Others would stay in the street to hold horses, watch the door, and keep curious people at a distance with gunfire if needed. Escape routes were mapped in detail, following back roads toward the southwest where they hoped to lose any pursuers in scattered farms, brush, and marshland. Sleep came lightly to men who had spent a decade living by their guns. Some lay awake listening to the sounds of Minnesota farms, crickets in the grass, an occasional dog, the lowing of cattle in distant pens. They had ridden hundreds of miles to find a new place to rob, and they believed that they had finally settled on the town that would give them the large haul they wanted. September 7th, 1876 began as a clear late summer morning in Northfield, Minnesota, with townspeople expecting another ordinary workday and no sense that armed strangers were closing in on them. Mist lifted from the Cannon River in small threads as the sun rose higher, showing the wooden bridge at the south end of town, the mill dam just upstream, and the stone foundations of the flour mills that lined the east bank. Mill hands crossed the bridge in 2s and 3s, some carrying lunch pails, others still chewing bread from hurried breakfasts. Wagon wheels clicked over the planks while drivers brought in grain from farms in Rice and Dakota counties, calling to their teams as they eased onto the approach and steered toward Mill Square. The mills started early. Inside the Ames mill and its neighbors, doors stood open to let out heat and dust. Workers hoisted sacks, checked machinery, and watched the chutes that carried grain down to grinding stones. Flour dust settled on shirts and hair and drifted out through the open windows to powder the alleyways behind the buildings. The steady grind and rattle of belts formed a low backdrop to the day, a noise that people in town had heard so often that they rarely noticed it unless the wheels stopped. To the north of the bridge, Division Street ran straight through the business district. Two-story brick buildings stood shoulder to shoulder with older wooden structures, their false fronts painted in solid colors. Signs advertised groceries, dry goods, banking, boots, harnesses, and hardware. The board sidewalks already held a few customers and clerks by 8 in the morning, sweeping dust from thresholds and tipping out pans of sweepings into the street. Housewives in plain dresses came in for coffee, sugar, or lamp oil. College students stepped around slower foot traffic on their way to recitations, books tucked under their arms. The First National Bank sat in the middle reach of the street, its brick front slightly more formal than some of its neighbors. The windows looked out on the main thoroughfare, and the front door opened directly onto the sidewalk. Inside, the air smelled of ink, paper, and coin. A waist-high counter separated the public area from the workspace. Behind it stood tall desks, shelves of ledgers, and the solid bulk of the iron safe at the rear. The safe did not dominate the room by size alone. Everyone who walked into the bank understood that what lay behind its door represented mortgages, college funds, and years of saved wages. Acting cashier Joseph Lee Haywood arrived before many customers. A precise man with a thin build, he was known for quiet speech and steady habits. He unlocked the door, stepped inside, and went first to the safe. His fingers moved over the handle, checking that it had remained sealed overnight. Once satisfied, he opened his desk, sorted correspondence, and made sure the day's cash was ready in the tills. He had recently taken on added responsibility while the regular cashier, Alonzo N. Sheldon, was away, and he carried that duty seriously. Teller Alonzo E. Bunker came in next, hanging his coat on its usual peg and taking his place at the window where customers would hand over checks and notes. He arranged his workstation without hurry but without wasted motion, setting ink bottles, pens, and paper in the positions he liked best. When he glanced through the front window, he saw only the familiar run of Division Street, with a few wagons rolling past, a dog nosing along the gutter, and a boy sweeping in front of Scriver's store. Across the way, merchant James Stacy Allen was already at work in his dry goods establishment. He raised the awning over the front windows, propped the door open, and directed a clerk to bring out bolts of cloth to catch the light. Allen's store mixed clothing, household goods, and odds and ends that farmers might need on short visits to town. That morning he thought only about orders, stock, and whether the day's trade would be brisk enough to justify opening more crates from the storeroom. When his eyes wandered toward the bank, as they did many times in the course of a day, he saw Haywood and Bunker moving through their tasks, small figures behind the glass. On the same side of the street as the bank, hardware and implement dealer Anselm Manning stood in the doorway of Scriver's store, which combined hardware, furniture, and undertaking services under one roof. He checked his display of plows and stoves, then looked with satisfaction at the racks of rifles and shotguns inside. For him, those firearms were stock items, pieces of iron and wood to be sold to hunters or farmers who wanted protection for their homes. It did not yet occur to him that before the day ended, guns taken from his own shelves would be used from upstairs windows against strangers firing in the street. Above one of the stores, medical student Henry Wheeler finished dressing in his rented room. He leaned on the window frame for a moment, looking down at the street below. From that height, he could see the pattern of the morning more clearly than those on the sidewalks. Farmers guided teams. Students moved in small knots, and shopkeepers busied themselves with displays and counters. Wheeler's mind was full of anatomy lessons and upcoming examinations. When he turned away from the window to gather his books, the notion that he might spend part of the afternoon with a rifle braced on that same sill remained unimaginable. Down closer to the river, laborer Nicholas Gustafson crossed toward Mill Square. The Swedish immigrant had come to Minnesota with the usual hopes, steady work, and the chance to build a life more secure than the one he had left behind. His English remained rough, but he understood the rhythms of farm and mill work. That morning he moved without hurry, stepping around wagon ruts and puddles, thinking about wages earned and meals ahead. He had no idea that the day would end with his name remembered as one of the raid's casualties. Northfield's streets held other familiar figures as the clock moved through the morning. Women with baskets walked from house to market. A blacksmith's hammer rang from an open-sided shop, beating out regular strokes on hot iron shoes. The depot agent checked his schedule for incoming freight. Children too young for school chased each other past fences, dodging out of the way when buggy wheels creaked by. In a town of fewer than 2,000 people, faces were known, habits were visible, and strangers stood out when they appeared. Yet on that morning there were no strangers on Division Street who drew concern. The only unfamiliar men in town at that hour were a few travelers at the hotel and a salesman with samples in his case, none of whom carried themselves like trained fighters. The outlaws who planned to strike the bank kept themselves out of view, waiting beyond town for the right time to appear. On farms west of Northfield near Millersburg, horses stamped and shook their heads while 8 hard men checked saddles and cinches. They had risen before full light, long since used to early starts. Leather creaked as they tightened girths and adjusted stirrups. Holsters were tested for easy draw. Each man made sure that the multiple pistols he carried were loaded and that spare cartridges were within reach. None of this preparation was dramatic. It was routine for men who had spent years living by calculated violence. These riders, including Frank and Jesse James and the younger brothers, had ridden together often enough that much could be done without talk. A glance, a nod, the placement of a horse in the line, all of it told them who would lead, who would hang back, and who would take particular roles once they reached town. Their clothing had been chosen with both travel and disguise in mind. Long dusters covered pistols and cartridge belts. Hats were pulled low. Facial hair had been trimmed or altered weeks earlier in St. Paul and other places where they had mixed with crowds. South of Northfield near Cannon City, the rest of the gang went through the same motions. They watered their horses at a trough, cinched saddles, and checked rifle scabbards. To any farmer watching from a doorway, they looked like cattle buyers or grain speculators. They paid fairly for feed and for a place to sleep the night before, which matched the story they told about looking for land or livestock. Their real aim, discussed softly in barns and back rooms, stayed hidden behind casual conversation. As the sun climbed, both groups began to shorten the distance to Northfield. The Millersburg riders took a route that let them approach from the west without traveling long stretches on the main road. They passed field after field where crews worked to bring in crops. Heads turned as the horses went by, but turned back again when the visitors did nothing more threatening than tip hats. The Cannon City riders moved north over similar roads, keeping to a pace that would bring them near the town around the same time as their comrades. Near midday, a pair of riders from the western group eased ahead. Their job was to look at Division Street with fresh eyes and confirm that the plan still made sense. They topped a slight rise and saw Northfield laid out ahead, with its bridge, mills, church spires, and the line of businesses that marked the center. Nothing in that vista suggested unusual danger. Smoke rose from chimneys and the faint sound of a mill whistle drifted on the breeze. They crossed the bridge at a walk, hooves thudding on sun-warmed planks. The Cannon River ran below them, not high enough to cause concern, not low enough to leave the mill wheels idle. On the far side, they passed into the town proper. Division Street lay before them. They guided their horses along the street at a deliberate pace, eyes taking in details without making that scrutiny obvious. They noted where hitching rails stood, where alleys opened between buildings, and how close the bank's door lay to the nearest corner. People on the sidewalks gave the riders casual glances. A few looked twice at the fine horses and good saddles. In a region where most men knew livestock, good horseflesh always drew comment, but no one stepped out to ask questions. The riders behaved like men used to handling money, not like drifters. They did not swear loudly or play the showy part of rowdies who wanted attention. Their manner told anyone watching that they expected to be left alone as they went about their business. Inside the bank, Haywood saw them only as shadows passing the front windows. His concern remained on balances and notes. He went over papers on his desk, thinking about obligations due, deposits expected, and the need to keep enough cash on hand for the day's business without exposing too much to risk. Memories of recent robberies in other states had reached Northfield through newspaper columns, and in the conversation earlier that week he had told his employer that he did not believe he could bring himself to open the safe for robbers. That thought sat quietly in his mind as principle, not yet as a decision that might cost him his life. Alonzo Bunker greeted customers as they arrived. A farmer from outside town came in to deposit the proceeds from a load of grain. A storekeeper from a side street cashed a small draft. Coins clinked into drawers, pen nibs scratched on paper, and routine transactions moved forward without delay. Anyone watching from the doorway would have seen a modest but confident bank carrying on the everyday work that held the town's finances together. Elsewhere along Division Street, talk turned on stray bits of news. Some men discussed reports about the nation's economy, still unsettled after the panic of 1873. Others mentioned shipments of wheat and the impact of prices in Minneapolis and Chicago. A few spoke of crime in distant states, stories of banks and trains robbed by gangs of former guerrillas from Missouri. Such stories were interesting, but they felt far away. Farmers and merchants in Northfield had no reason to believe that the same men would ride so far north just to test their luck here. At the depot, an employee noted freight scheduled to arrive later in the day, including goods bound for local merchants and supplies for Carleton College. The presence of the colleges gave the town a broader character than some nearby settlements. Students from other states and from abroad walked the same streets as farmhands and shopkeepers. Faculty families brought books and expectations from Eastern schools. That mix of people helped support the bank, the stores, and the mills, and it reinforced a general sense that Northfield belonged to a settled, forward-looking part of the country. On the outskirts, school children headed home for the midday meal, some cutting across fields, others following wagon roads. They passed within sight of the roads where the Outlaws rode, but did not recognize anything unusual. To their eyes, the men on horseback were just another group of travelers. The children's shouts and laughter floated across the fields, faint sounds that reached the riders for a moment and then faded as distance increased. By late morning, the gang had reassembled outside town at prearranged points. Short discussions confirmed the timing. They would wait until early afternoon when the streets held enough people to mask their movement, but not so many that a crowd could quickly organize a defense. The men who were to enter the bank reviewed the signals they would use among themselves. Those designated to stay outside thought about where to hold their horses, where to station themselves on the street, and how to respond if anyone tried to interfere. Back in Northfield, the town's clock moved steadily toward the hour that would mark the beginning of the raid. The people whose actions would shape the defense of the town went about their normal business, unaware that their routines were the last minutes of a peace that would not fully return. In fields and farmyards, just beyond the line of houses, 8 strangers finished the last calm preparations for an assault that would test whether this Minnesota community would panic under fire or meet gunmen with gunmen. About 2 in the afternoon, September 7th, 1876. 8 armed riders came over the rise toward Northfield with their faces set for work that would either make them rich or leave them dead in a town that did not even know their names. The air had turned warmer since morning, flattening the light over stubbled fields and rows of corn. Harvest work paused while farmers and hired hands took their midday meals. In the distance, Northfield showed itself as a cluster of roofs and false fronts, with the grain elevators and mill buildings standing higher than most houses. The Cannon River cut its course behind the mills, and the approach to town narrowed into the road that led toward the main street. To men who had spent years riding into danger, the view looked calm and promising, a place where people trusted brick walls and reputations more than guns. The gang halted for a moment out of sight of the town, on a stretch of road with a fringe of trees and brush. Saddles creaked as they shifted their weight and loosened shoulders tight from hours in the saddle. Each man checked his own weapons without ceremony. One revolver came halfway out of a holster to make sure it cleared smoothly, then slid back into place. Fingers brushed over the caps and cartridges that would decide whether they left town alive. A short exchange settled final details. Who would ride at the head? Who would dismount first? Who would walk through the bank door? No one raised his voice. They had discussed every point the night before, and now they only confirmed it. They moved off the shoulder and onto the main approach in a loose file, not tight enough to look like a military unit, but close enough to keep control. 2 men rode at the front. Behind them came a staggered line of 3, then 3 more, each rider keeping a space that let him wheel or spur ahead if something unexpected happened. Dust lifted from the horses' hooves as they closed the last stretch before the bridge, soft puffs that drifted back over the road. From a distance, they resembled any group of traveling businessmen with good horses and better clothes than a typical farmhand. The bridge at the south edge of town carried them over the river on heavy timbers that thrummed under iron shoes. None of the riders looked down at the water. Their eyes stayed ahead on the mouth of the street where the business district began. A wagon rolled past in the opposite direction, driver hunched on the seat, more interested in his own load than in the strangers. One of the outlaws lifted a hand in an easy half-greeting. The driver nodded and rolled on, already forgetting their faces. Once across the bridge, they entered the real heart of Northfield. To the left lay Mill Square with its jumble of warehouses, mill offices, and sheds. To the right, Division Street ran straight ahead, lined with shops and offices. The riders shifted formation without needing to signal. 4 men angled toward the mill side to drift and watch, while the others continued along the main street toward the bank. The motion looked casual enough that no one on the sidewalks connected it to anything beyond ordinary movement. On Division Street that hour, the boardwalks carried more people than in the morning, but still left space between groups. The midday lull had begun to break. Farmers who had eaten their dinners now came back into town for afternoon business. A few carriages stood at the curbs. A dog slept in a patch of shade near a hitching rail. Shop doors stood open to let in any trace of breeze. From upstairs windows, curtains stirred as housewives and boarders leaned out to look over the street for a moment before returning to chores. The outlaws who remained on the main street let their horses walk. Their coats hung loose, hiding pistols and belts. Hats shaded their expressions. They passed men who would later remember them in extraordinary detail. But at that moment, their features blended into the ordinary flow of faces seen in any small city. One of the riders glanced at the clock mounted on a nearby building and saw that they had hit their chosen hour. The hands stood close enough to 2 that the bank's staff would be settled for the afternoon, not distracted by opening or closing tasks. They stopped their horses within a short distance of the First National Bank. The building did not look imposing to men who had robbed larger places. It was a compact structure with a plain front and tall windows, nothing like the grand marble institutions in cities. That modest look reassured them. Wealth inside such a building would be concentrated, not spread across multiple branches. One of the riders slid down from his saddle and tied his horse to a post. Another did the same. A third remained mounted, holding the reins of the others and positioning himself where he could see both the door and the length of the street. Across the way, merchant James Stacy Allen had stepped into his doorway for a breath of outside air. He wiped his hands on his apron and squinted toward the bank. He saw the strangers dismount. He noticed one man stand with his back to the door as if taking a casual position that nonetheless blocked the entrance from the immediate view of passers-by. Allen watched for another moment, curious but not yet alarmed. Travelers came to Northfield with money every week. Some invested in land, some bought machinery. Well-mounted men near the bank could have any one of several reasons to be there. On the mill side of town, the riders assigned to watch that quarter carried out their own part of the plan. One man lingered near the entrance to a feed store, ostensibly studying a notice tacked to the wall. Another rode a slow loop through Mill Square, eyes sweeping the approaches that led down to the bridge and up toward the main street. A third positioned himself near the road that would carry them south after the robbery, making sure there were no obstacles that had not been there during earlier scouting. Their presence blended with the natural activity around mills and warehouses where horses and wagons came and went all day. Back at the bank, the three men chosen for the inside work stepped toward the door. Contemporary accounts and later testimony place Frank James, Charlie Pitts, and Bob Younger in that trio. One pushed the door open and they entered side by side rather than in single file, a detail that increased their control of the front room from the first step. To anyone looking through the window, they resembled new customers, perhaps investors or cattle buyers ready to discuss drafts and deposits. Once the door closed behind them, the true nature of their visit showed in the way they moved. Inside, the room cooled them after the sun on the street. Acting cashier Joseph Lee Haywood and teller Alonzo Bunker looked up from their stations. Before either could speak, one of the newcomers stepped forward toward the counter and presented a check clipped to a letter. In a calm voice, he asked to have it cashed, naming a respectable amount. As Haywood focused on the paper, the second man moved along the counter to a point that gave him a clearer field of fire. The third remained slightly back nearer the door where he could watch both the street and the interior. Haywood took the check and read it. Something about the document or the way it was presented did not sit right with him. His face did not show alarm, but he did not immediately move to honor it. He asked a question, one that required the supposed customer to say more about his business. There was a short exchange that revealed to the visitors that this man would not be easily led into a careless move. At that point, they dropped the last pretense. The man nearest the counter produced a revolver and laid it where Haywood and Bunker could see it. He told them plainly that this was a robbery and that they were to obey orders if they wished to live. Another drew his weapon and repeated the message. The third turned fully toward the door, pistol ready at his side. In a single moment, the quiet bank shifted from an ordinary place of figures and ledgers to a room under armed control. Haywood and Bunker remained behind the counter, unarmed and outnumbered. Out on Division Street, Allen still watched from his doorway. Through the bank's window, he could not hear words, but he saw one man inside lift his arm in a way that did not match normal business. Allen stepped off his threshold, crossed the street, and moved toward the bank entrance. He pushed the door open, stepping into the space where the third robber stood guard. For an instant, he saw the pistols, the set faces, and Haywood and Bunker held in place behind the counter. One of the outlaws swung toward Allen and shoved him back, forcing him out of the doorway. The contact was hard enough to spin him partly around. As the door swung nearly shut again, Alan regained his balance on the walk. He understood now that this was no quiet business discussion. Years of working in that street, of seeing routine and knowing when it broke, had given him an instant measure of danger. He turned away from the door fast, heart pounding, mind already moving past shock toward action. Near Mill Square, the men watching that quadrant heard none of this first exchange, but they kept to their positions. Their job depended on not crowding the bank front, which might alarm people too early. One rider pretended to adjust his saddle cinch beside his horse, head bent, eyes flicking toward the main street whenever an opening between buildings allowed. Another dismounted and stood with one foot on a wagon wheel, pretending to examine the boards stacked nearby. Their uneventful poses made their real mission easier. No one in Mill Square had any idea that gunmen were holding the town's bank staff at pistol point just a short distance away. Back on Division Street, Alan took 3 or 4 quick strides away from the entrance he had just been forced out of. The street felt different beneath his feet, the ordinary afternoon suddenly wrong. He knew that inside the bank, unarmed friends faced armed strangers. He also knew that any hesitation could cost lives and money that belonged not just to the owners of the building but to neighbors and families all over the county. He swung toward the middle of the street, ready to do the one thing immediately within his power. The outlaws outside the bank saw his sudden movement. The man holding the reins tightened his grip and sat straighter in the saddle, hands sliding nearer to the butt of his revolver. Another rider shifted his horse a step to improve his line on the bank door and on anyone who might come running. Conversations on the sidewalk nearby faltered as a few bystanders sensed that something was not quite right, though they did not yet know why. Along the street, some faces turned toward Alan as he drew a breath. In that fraction of time, Northfield still believed itself safe. Wagons creaked, students walked. A clerk carried a crate out of a doorway. The weight of what was happening inside the bank had not yet reached them. The entire future of the next few minutes balanced on whether one merchant would choose to stay silent or to risk everything by calling others into danger. Alan chose, loudly. He opened his mouth and began to shout words that would rip the town's quiet apart and turn an attempted quick robbery into a fight that none of the 8 men from Missouri had expected when they rode over the bridge and onto Division Street. September 7th, 1876. Early afternoon in Northfield shifted in a few heartbeats from ordinary business to a fight for control of Division Street after James Stacy Allen shouted that the bank was being robbed. Alan's voice carried the length of the block. "Get your guns, boys, they are robbing the bank," he yelled, turning as he ran. Men in front of nearby stores froze for an instant, then broke in different directions. Some ducked inside for weapons. Others scanned the street for the strangers on horseback who had looked harmless only minutes before. The quiet murmur of town sounds broke apart into quick shouts, running feet, and the first sharp cracks of gunfire as outlaws and townsmen began to shoot at each other. Near the bank door, one of the gang swung his pistol up and fired a warning shot into the air, trying to frighten the growing crowd back. The report echoed between the brick walls and pushed more people off the sidewalks and into doorways. Another outlaw on horseback turned down the street and fired low at Alan, who dived for cover behind a hitching post. The bullet snapped past him and hit wood, sending a splinter spinning. Alan felt the impact in the post and understood that he had used up a good share of luck just by remaining on his feet. Across the way, hardware man Anselm Manning heard the alarm and reacted without hesitation. He rushed through his store toward the gun racks, grabbed a rifle he trusted, and seized a handful of cartridges. In the same motion, he moved toward a doorway that looked out over Division Street. He worked the action, dropped a cartridge into the chamber, and brought the butt to his shoulder. Manning was not a professional soldier, but years of handling firearms had taught him how to set his sights and steady his breathing. He picked one of the mounted men in outlaw gear, set the front sight on the man's chest, and squeezed the trigger. On the upper floor of a nearby building, medical student Henry Wheeler had responded to the shout. By racing back to his rented room, a rifle stood inside, kept for hunting and for emergencies. His hands shook as he loaded it, but training and repeated practice took over. He threw open the window, braced the barrel on the sill, and looked down on a pattern that had changed completely since that morning. Division Street now held armed riders turning in tight circles, townsmen crouched behind posts and wagons, and panicked citizens diving for any kind of cover. Wheeler forced himself to ignore the confusion and pick out a single target. One of the outlaws, later identified as Clell Miller, sat on his horse near the bank, revolver in hand, shouting orders to his companions. He wore a long coat and a hat pulled low, but his position and behavior marked him as a leader. Wheeler centered him in the rifle's sights. He knew that if he missed, the man would continue to direct the attack and might fire on more civilians. Holding his breath, Wheeler pressed the trigger. The rifle bucked hard against his shoulder. The bullet struck Miller in the face. He reeled in the saddle, then toppled toward the street, hitting the ground heavily beside his horse. The animal danced sideways, reins trailing. For a moment, Miller tried to push himself up, but his body failed him. He collapsed again and lay still in the dirt. Wheeler worked the bolt, chambered another round, and went back to the sight picture, his heart hammering in his chest. He had never killed a man before. There was no time to think about that. Other riders still moved in the street. Manning had seen the same man a moment earlier and had shifted his sights when Wheeler's shot dropped him. Manning now picked out another outlaw, William Bill Chadwell, who maneuvered his horse to cover the front of the bank. Chadwell had drawn his pistol and was looking for targets among the citizens. Manning rested his rifle against a door frame, took careful aim at the rider's torso, and fired. The slug hit Chadwell hard. He lurched in the saddle, clutching at the wound, then slid off to one side. He fell to the street and tried to pull himself behind a nearby object for shelter, but his strength was already going. Blood spread under him on the dust of Division Street. Within seconds, both Miller and Chadwell lay down in full view. Two of the gang's outside men killed by townspeople who had never expected to fight a battle in front of their own businesses. The fall of two mounted outlaws did not end the gunfire. Other gang members returned shots at every window and doorway where they saw movement. Bullets punched into the fronts of stores, shattered panes, and smashed into door frames. One round tore through a signboard and slammed into the wall behind it. Another hit the frame of a second-story window inches from Wheeler's head, spraying him with splinters of wood and glass. He ducked, then rose again to fire a second time, focusing now on keeping their heads down rather than making another killing shot. On the street level, townsmen who had grabbed weapons began to appear in greater numbers. Some carried rifles taken from their homes or from the hardware store. Others brought shotguns usually used on game birds. A few had only pistols kept for personal protection. They spread out along Division Street using hitching posts, barrels, wagons, and open doors as makeshift barricades. In a short span of time, the bank district had turned into a line of small firing positions held by men who knew each other by first name. Not everyone caught in the street carried a gun. Swedish laborer Nicholas Gustafsson, confused by the shouted English and the sudden shots, ran toward cover near the corner of Division Street and 5th Street. He did not understand the commands being yelled by either side. As he crossed an open patch, a bullet meant for an outlaw or a defender hit him in the head. He dropped without a word. People nearby saw him fall and dragged him to one side when they could, but he did not regain consciousness. His injury would soon be recognized as mortal, another casualty in a fight he had not chosen. Inside the bank, the three robbers heard all of this through the walls. When they finally burst from the door at the end of their struggle with Haywood, they stepped into a storm. Smoke from rifles and pistols drifted in the air. The street that had looked so calm when they arrived now held wounded men, dead companions, and defenders who had already proved that they could shoot accurately from cover. The first robber out of the door fired both pistols at the nearest visible townsman trying to clear a path toward the horses. The second kept his head low and concentrated on reaching the mounts. The third split his attention between shooting and scanning for Miller and Chadwell. He saw the bodies on the ground and understood at once that their position had collapsed far more than any of them had expected. The withdrawal they had planned as an orderly ride back across the bridge would now be a scramble under accurate fire. Frank and Jesse James, who had been positioned away from the bank door earlier in the plan, rode back toward the scatter of their men, drawing more fire as they came. One of them shouted to haul the wounded and get moving. There was no chance to retrieve the dead. Miller and Chadwell lay out in the open close to townsmen with rifles. Any attempt to drag them to horses would bring every barrel onto the rescuer. That fact cut hard. In Missouri, they had often been able to reclaim fallen comrades. Northfield offered no such opportunity. Cole, Jim, and Bob Younger fought their way toward the bank front, revolvers drawn. As they moved, a bullet struck Bob in the right elbow. The impact shattered bone and tore through flesh. His arm dropped, nearly useless, but he held his reins and a pistol with his left hand and kept going. Another round hit Jim in the shoulder, driving him sideways in the saddle. Blood spread across his shirt, but he remained mounted. Cole caught splinters and fragments as bullets struck near him, and soon he too carried fresh wounds. In a few moments of concentrated fire, half the remaining gang took hits that would slow them for the rest of the escape. Townsmen kept up their pressure. Manning reloaded quickly and fired again, aiming now into the center of riders. Wheeler chambered another round upstairs and sent it toward a man who was trying to bring a horse close to the bank door. Other citizens, such as Elias Stacy and William H.P.H. Carlton, joined in, each adding their shots to the irregular but determined line of defense. Their fire was not as disciplined as that of trained troops, but it came from many directions and made it dangerous for the outlaws to linger in any one spot. One outlaw's horse went down under him as a bullet hit the animal. The rider crashed to the street, rolled, and scrambled up again, limping. He grabbed at another horse's stirrup and was pulled to safety by a companion already in motion. Another man's hat flew off as a bullet clipped its brim. Chips of brick and splinters of wood flew from building fronts when shots went wide. The sound of gunfire became nearly continuous, broken only by the shouts of men calling targets and orders. In the midst of this, some townspeople risked themselves to pull the wounded out of the line of fire. Men dragged Gustafson toward shelter. Others crawled to help citizens hit by stray rounds. The defenders had not sought this fight, but once it started, they took responsibility for both resistance and rescue. Women watched from doorways and windows, some praying aloud, others calling warnings when they saw riders change position. The entire main street had become a single crowded scene of resistance, hurt, and determination. The gang could not hold the ground in front of the bank. Their attempt at a controlled show of force had failed within minutes because the town had met them with unexpected courage and speed. With the safe still locked, 2 men dead in the street, several others wounded, and citizens firing from every angle, they faced a single clear choice. Break away now or be killed or captured right there on Division Street. A brief shouted exchange settled their course. The word passed from rider to rider. They would abandon any idea of regaining the bank, leave Miller and Chadwell on the ground, and ride hard out of town together before the defenders could close a tighter ring around them. Pistols still in hand, they tugged their horses' heads toward the south, pointed them toward the bridge, and spurred forward through the line of fire. As the remaining outlaws galloped away from the bank, bullets followed them. Some struck flesh and added to their wounds. Others hit saddles, stirrups, and horseflesh, adding confusion and pain. Yet the momentum of several strong animals carrying desperate men carried them through the worst of the crossfire. They pounded toward the bridge they had crossed so confidently earlier that day, leaving behind 2 dead comrades, a murdered cashier on the bank floor, a mortally wounded immigrant in the street, and a town that had proved willing and able to defend itself with every gun it could lay hands on. Late afternoon, September 7th, 1876, the surviving outlaws drove their horses off Division Street, over the bridge, and out onto the country road with the whole raid already collapsing behind them. Hooves hammered the planks as they crossed the Cannon River again, this time with bullets still fresh in their minds and blood on more than one shirt. Shots from town followed them but began to thin as the distance grew. Once they hit the dirt beyond the bridge, the riders leaned low over their saddles and let their horses run. Dust boiled up behind them, veiling the view back toward the brick fronts and mill buildings where they had planned to leave only fear and empty vaults. They had nothing like what they had come for. Instead of a fortune from the safe, they carried only the scattered cash and coins grabbed from drawers and counters. 2 of their number, Clell Miller and Bill Chadwell, lay dead in the street. Acting cashier Joseph Lee Haywood was down on the bank floor. Swedish laborer Nicholas Gustafson was lying wounded in the business district. Several of the riders still in the saddle were bleeding. The escape started not as a triumphant flight with full pockets, but as a retreat under fire with the odds suddenly reversed. Bob Younger rode with his right arm hanging wrong at his side, the shattered elbow giving him bolts of pain every time his horse jolted. He held the reins in his left hand and clenched his teeth against the shock that came with each stride. Jim Younger had taken a round in the shoulder and felt wet warmth spreading across his clothing. Cole Younger carried fresh wounds of his own, less crippling but still serious. Charlie Pitts and the James brothers had escaped the town's crossfire without crippling injury, but their clothes showed cuts and powder marks from near misses. They did not speak much in the first mile. Breath went into urging the horses and staying upright. The road bent gradually as it left the river, passing farms whose residents had heard the gunfire and now stood in yards or fields, shading their eyes, trying to make sense of it. To some, the sight of the fleeing men looked like nothing more than a group of hard-riding travelers. To others, the speed and the drawn pistols told a clearer story. A few farmers reached automatically for long guns kept near doors, but the riders were already past, flinging clods from the road as they ran. Behind them, Northfield was not content to let the gang go. As soon as the shooting in front of the bank eased enough to move, men who had been firing from windows and behind hitching posts rushed to check the wounded and the dead. They found Miller and Chadwell on the ground and Haywood inside the bank. Bunker, who had reached safety despite his wound, told what had happened from the moment the strangers walked in with the fake check to the second he was shot as he fled through the back door. The facts sank in quickly. The town's banker had refused to open the safe and had been killed for it. The robbers had left with far less money than they had sought. 2 gunmen lay dead. Others were hurt. While some men stayed to guard the bodies and help the injured, others turned their attention to pursuit. Horses were grabbed from hitching rails and from nearby barns. Saddles were thrown on in haste. Weapons came from homes, shops, and the hardware store. There was no waiting for formal orders. Groups formed around whoever could ride and shoot, and within a short time the first pursuers were heading out on the same road the gang had taken. Their goal was simple: stay close enough to keep pressure on the fleeing band until more organized forces could be brought to bear. In town, the telegraph operator worked furiously. Messages went out along the lines in several directions, telling nearby communities that the James and Younger gang had attempted to rob the bank at Northfield and were now fleeing south and west with wounded men among them. Short, blunt descriptions of Miller and Chadwell and of the surviving riders were tapped out and sent to law officers and railway points. The telegraph had turned many earlier chases into hopeless efforts for outlaws, and the gang now found that the wires they had tried to outflank by coming so far north could carry their description to every junction town in the region before the day ended. On the road, the band began to ease their pace once they knew they were out of direct rifle range from town. They could not keep the horses at a dead run for long, especially with wounded men in the saddles. They slowed to a strong trot, then to a fast walk in stretches where they needed to save strength. Cole looked over at his brothers and saw plainly that they could not keep this up forever. Bob's face had gone gray, blood soaked his sleeve and dripped down his wrist. Jim was hunched, gripping his reins tighter than he realized to keep his balance as pain flared whenever his horse stumbled. The first small group of pursuers came into view behind them not long after they left the river. Dust on the horizon resolved into riders who knew the countryside better than the gang, and who had the advantage of fresh mounts not yet worked hard that day. The outlaws saw them, counted numbers, and judged the distance. They were not yet under immediate threat of being run down, but they knew that more riders would be joining the chase with each passing mile. When the road rose slightly and the terrain opened, one of the outlaws wheeled his horse, raised his pistol, and fired back at the pursuers to remind them that they were chasing armed men who still had ammunition to spend. Smoke drifted from the revolver's muzzle in the late daylight. The shot did not strike anyone, but it did its work by making the men behind them check their speed and spread out to avoid presenting an easy target. The gang turned forward again and pushed on. They aimed toward the familiar route through Millersburg country, using their earlier scouting rides to choose roads that bent between farmsteads and patches of trees rather than the straightest lines. The intention was to put as many turns as possible between themselves and the main pursuit to create chances for ambush if the posse pressed too close, and to head eventually toward rougher ground, where scattered timber and marshes could hide horses and men. At more than one farm, they slowed just enough to assess whether they could trade tired horses for fresher ones. When they needed to, they rode straight into yards with pistols visible and demanded mounts. Some residents refused and ran for cover, but others, seeing the weapons and the blood, gave up their best animals rather than invite a shooting match. Saddles were stripped from blown horses and thrown onto new backs while brief threats and curses flew. A few men were pushed aside. A woman cried out as one of the gang shoved past her to reach a barn door. Within minutes, the outlaws were in the saddle again, leaving farm families shaken and furious but alive. As the gang changed horses, the pursuers gained ground. Some of the men from Northfield had taken direct cross-country routes, cutting across fields where fences were low. Others had joined from nearby farms. A loose line of farmers, merchants, students, and laborers on horseback now stretched along the road. None of them trained as cavalry, but all of them driven by anger over a murdered banker and wounded neighbors. They had learned already that the men they chased were willing to shoot into crowds. That knowledge did not keep them from coming. Late in the afternoon, a more serious exchange took place near the Millersburg area, where the road narrowed between patches of brush and small rises. The outlaws knew that the pursuers were close and decided to teach them caution. They reined their horses off the main road into a position that let them fire from partial cover when the first chasing riders appeared. When the posse came into sight, still riding hard, the gang opened fire. Several shots cracked out in quick succession. One of the citizens' horses screamed and went down, tumbling its rider into the dirt. Another man felt a bullet tear through his clothing and raise a welt along his side. The line of pursuers broke for a moment as they hauled on reins and sought cover of their own. Men who had never drawn a gun on anything more than game animals found themselves returning fire toward figures they could only partly see. Dust and smoke mingled as both sides fired from awkward positions. The outlaws did not linger longer than needed. As soon as they had made the point that they could still hit back, they pulled away again, driving their now fresher horses down another road toward the southwest. The delay had bought them a small measure of distance at the cost of more anger in the men behind them. The wounded citizen riders were assisted by their companions. Their injuries, painful but not always fatal, hardened the resolve of the entire region. News of those hits joined the telegraphed warnings confirming that the gang was not simply running but was prepared to leave a trail of blood in their wake. North of them, other posses mounted as the word spread through towns connected by road and rail. In places like Dundas, Faribault, and other settlements in southern Minnesota, men gathered in response to the telegraph messages. Sheriffs organized some of the groups. In other cases, prominent local citizens took the lead. They studied hastily sketched maps, looked at likely escape routes, and tried to angle their rides to cut off the fugitives rather than merely follow. Railroads prepared to move volunteers closer to the expected paths with flat cars, allowing horses and riders to cover more ground quickly when they disembarked. Back on the line of flight, the gang's wounded struggled. Bob's shattered arm had swollen inside his sleeve. Every jolt sent a new wave of pain through him and threatened to knock him from the saddle. Jim's shoulder wound bled steadily, soaking into his clothes and turning the skin beneath cold and sticky. Cole forced himself to ride point often, both to keep his brothers moving and to set a pace that their horses could endure despite the urgency. The James brothers kept scanning the horizon and the road behind, anxious for any sign that a larger, better-armed posse was gaining. The countryside itself was still and indifferent. Sun dropped lower over fields where crops waited for harvest. Stands of timber cast longer shadows across pastures. Livestock grazed in enclosures along their route. Dogs barked as the riders passed and chased along fences until they tired and dropped away. Smoke rose straight up from farmhouse chimneys in the calm, late afternoon air. The landscape gave no sign that within a short span of time it had become the corridor for one of the largest manhunts the region would ever see. Near a small settlement, the gang paused long enough to raid a store for bandages and basic supplies. A frightened clerk was forced at gunpoint to hand over cloth and a bottle of spirits that could be used to clean wounds. In the shadow of a barn, they did what rough patching they could. A shirt was torn into strips for Bob's arm. Whiskey was poured over open flesh until the wounded men could barely stand the sting. There was no thought of proper surgery or rest. They had to stop bleeding enough to stay in the saddle. While they tended injuries, one of the riders kept watch at the edge of the yard. When he saw dust again on the distant road, he warned the others. They dropped the makeshift dressings in place as quickly as they could, grabbed their gear, and mounted up once more. The brief pause had cost them ground, but without it, their wounded might have given out entirely. As evening approached, the first full day of the chase settled into a pattern. The gang would push forward, then slow to spare the horses and the injured. The pursuers would close enough to see them again. Shots would be exchanged at long or medium range, and then the outlaws would spur away. Telegraphed reports urged new groups of citizens and law officers into the saddle from fresh directions. The escape route, chosen with care in the days before the raid, now had to serve as a moving battlefield and a thread linking one hurried decision to the next. By the time the sun neared the horizon, the gang had traveled a significant distance from Northfield but had not broken free of the net forming around them. They knew they could not risk remaining on prominent roads once full darkness fell, because every farm, crossroads, and rail station within many miles had been alerted. Instead, they began to angle away from more traveled routes, looking for stretches of rougher country where they could hide themselves and their horses for the night. They found temporary shelter near scattered trees and low ground where brush grew thick. There, with fading light to cover them, they dismounted, loosened saddles, and let the horses breathe while they considered their next move. The wounded men eased themselves down with care. Every motion hurt. They ate a little from what they carried, drank water from nearby sources, and argued in low voices about direction and risk. Some favored turning more sharply west and then south, hoping to slide between the lines of posses. Others believed they should keep angling toward familiar territory in Iowa and beyond. Whatever the exact path to come, one fact stood clear to all of them as night settled over the fields. The raid on Northfield had failed in every way that mattered. They had lost men, gained only small sums of money, and awakened a region that had proved ready to fight hard in defense of its bank and streets. They were now deep in country that no longer saw them as anonymous travelers. The next days would not be a quiet ride home, but a running fight against a growing number of armed citizens and law officers determined to bring them down before they could reach the border. Cold air sat over the low country along the Watonwan River as the September light came up gray and thin, and the last 4 fugitives of the broken gang pushed through wet grass that reached their thighs. Cole Younger moved with a stiff, halting step, every shift of his weight sending pain through the wounds he had been carrying since the fight in town. Jim Younger's jaw throbbed constantly where a bullet had cut him days earlier. Bob Younger's chest burned when he tried to draw a deep breath. Charlie Pitts, who had fewer injuries than the others, carried most of the visible load, but even he walked with his shoulders rounded from exhaustion. The horses they had managed to hold on to were lean, sweat-stained, and nervous at every sound from the surrounding brush. The escape across southern Minnesota had become a long grind instead of a clean run. The earlier rush away from the town, the forced ride through Dundas, the hurried crossing of farms and back roads had long since given way to a slower, more painful movement on foot. The big woods and the sloughs west of Shieldsville had taken their toll. Rain had soaked the men during more than one night, and the lowlands bred mosquitoes that found every strip of exposed skin. When they cut through brush or climbed over fallen trunks, their clothes pulled tight against bandages that were already filthy. The wounds that had only stung on the first day now oozed and swelled. Flies found the blood whenever they stopped long enough to breathe. Behind them, scattered across counties, were men who refused to let the matter rest. Farmers, merchants, Civil War veterans, and local law officers had been answering telegraphed calls since the first messages were tapped out of Northfield. Long stretches of rail and wire carried descriptions of the outlaws and their injuries from town to town. Every station platform, grain elevator, and churchyard became a place where notice of the raid was read aloud. Some posses formed quickly, only to give out after a day's hard riding. Others grew as fresh men took the places of those whose horses gave up. By the time the gang turned farther west, some groups of pursuers counted several hundred riders at their peak, although no single body stayed together for long. The countryside was awake and watching in a way it had never been before. For the 4 wounded men trying to move through it, every farmhouse and patch of open road was a problem. They needed food, dry clothing, and information about which roads were guarded, but any contact with settled ground carried a risk. More than once they circled wide around a cluster of buildings after seeing a crowd of horses tied out front, or hearing the echo of distant shots that signaled practice or nervous firing. They kept to low ground wherever they could, favoring sloughs and tree lines that broke up their outline. The strain made itself obvious on the men who had once ridden together with easy confidence. Cole Younger, still, the most seasoned and decisive voice among them, had to spend more time urging instead of planning. When Bob coughed and bent over the saddle horn, Cole held back the impatience and reached to steady him instead. Jim, with the torn jaw that made every mouthful a trial, had stopped talking unless he had no choice. Pitts, who had signed on as a partner in crime rather than as a loyal brother, began to cast glances at the others that mixed concern with calculation. The separation from the James brothers had taken place days earlier near open country in the vicinity of Lake Crystal. Frank and Jesse still had better horses and fewer wounds, and they could see that staying as a single group slowed everyone down and gave the posses a single trail to follow. Under a gray sky with a chill wind coming across the fields, they had held a quiet discussion off the main road. No one shouted. There was no time or strength for argument. Each man knew the conditions. The James brothers were unwounded enough to keep moving at a pace the others could no longer match. Frank spoke in measured tones about drawing pursuers away and using working rail lines and river crossings to make for the Dakota border and then home. Jesse, whose temper had burned hotter in earlier days, looked across the soaked land and seemed to calculate distances and risks with hard eyes. Cole, bandaged and bruised, understood that the wounded men could not outdistance the horseflesh and stamina that remained under Frank and Jesse. In the end, the plan formed in a few blunt sentences. The James brothers would leave on the best mounts, riding west and then south, using stolen horses when needed. The Youngers and Pitts would keep to the low ground and move at whatever pace their injuries allowed. After a last exchange of hands on shoulders and brief words that carried no sentimentality, the gang that had ridden together for years divided for the last time. The two James brothers turned their horses toward the farther prairie and were soon only moving shapes in the distance, while Cole, Jim, Bob, and Pitts turned back toward cover, leading the weaker horses and seeking another slough where they could vanish for a few hours. The knowledge that the original band was gone for good settled on the four remaining men without ceremony. That knowledge did not ease their exhaustion or reduce the constant pressure of the hunt. As the days passed, the ground they crossed became more monotonous and more dangerous at the same time. The routes near towns such as Mankato were lined with people who had already heard of the raid and watched every rider who passed with suspicion. Telegraph keys continued to click in stations where operators repeated descriptions that singled out wounded outlaws, fancy pistols, and the remnants of linen dusters. Whenever mounted men appeared on a distant rise, the fugitives turned aside, even if that meant plunging through marsh water that reached their knees. The horses sank and pulled free again with effort, leaving muddy prints that any half-awake farm boy could follow. The weather added its own pressure. Night air brought a damp cold that shook bodies already weakened by loss of blood. The men tried to start small fires in low hollows to warm their hands and dry socks, scraping together whatever brush they could find. But flames risked drawing attention. More than once a spark was stamped out quickly when the sound of a horse or wagon drifted near. They slept in turns, curled against trees or lying in the reeds with their coats pulled tight, keeping weapons close enough that a hand could close on a grip in the dark without searching. Food became a constant concern. They could not ride into towns and pay openly for meals without risking recognition, and they no longer looked like prosperous cattlemen. Their faces were pale under the dirt, beards had grown in uneven patches, and their hats were stained. By the middle of the second week, even the carefully folded banknotes they carried were damp and crumpled, and they knew that every owner of a small store or farmyard had been warned that injured strangers might try to use just such money. The men began to knock on doors only in the most isolated places, presenting themselves as travelers caught out by the weather and asking for bread, milk, and a chance to warm themselves by a stove. On the morning of September 21st, the four reached a farmstead near a body of water known locally as Linden Lake, not far from the Watonwan River, and a slough where the ground sank into soft, brush-covered bottomland. The farm belonged to a family with sons accustomed to hard work in the fields. The air carried the smell of damp earth and early autumn leaves, and a thin smoke rose from the farmhouse chimney. The men approached carefully, leaving their horses in the lee of a small stand of trees and walking the last stretch on foot with their coats pulled tight to cover weapons and blood-stained shirts. At the door, they asked for food. The farmer's wife, noting their condition, gave them bread and a simple meal. One of the sons, a teenage boy, watched from a short distance, taking in every detail. The strangers' faces held a mix of pain and wariness. Their clothes, once of good quality, were now torn and stiff with dried blood and dirt. One man kept a hand pressed close to his chest. Another moved his jaw as if each word cost effort. The boy had heard descriptions of the outlaws and had looked at printed handbills and newspapers when they reached the area. The images had fixed themselves in his mind. As he watched these four men eat, recognition settled in. He did not speak up. Instead, he made note of the direction in which the men led their horses when they left the farmyard and waited until they were away from the buildings. Then he caught his own horse, climbed on bareback, and rode hard toward Madelia. The distance was not short, but he urged the animal on, knowing that every minute he gained might make the difference between a clear trail and a vanished one. His arrival in the small town brought the kind of report that people had been waiting to hear for almost 2 weeks. Wounded strangers matching the descriptions moving on foot and horseback near the Watonwan bottomlands. Sheriff James Glispin of Watonwan County had already been dealing with rumors and false alarms. This report carried the ring of detail. The boy's account of wounds, clothing, and direction matched what telegraph messages and newspaper lines had been spreading. Glispin listened, asked pointed questions, and then made his decision. He called for a small party instead of a large mounted crowd that might blunder and scare the fugitives deeper into the slough. The men who answered were familiar faces from the town and the surrounding area, men he trusted to keep their heads under strain. Among those who gathered were Captain W. W. Murphy, a veteran with experience in handling men under fire, Colonel T. L. Vaught, George A. Bradford, Charles A. Pomeroy, Benjamin Rice, and S. J. Severson. They were not uniformed soldiers, but they knew firearms and the local ground. Each man checked his gear with practiced movements, cinching saddle straps, examining rifle sights, and topping off revolver cylinders with steady hands. The sheriff outlined what he knew of the slough south and west of town, where the Watonwan River broke into low marsh and plum thickets that could conceal both horses and men. The objective was simple and exact. Locate the outlaws, prevent any escape, and bring them in alive if possible, dead if they forced another kind of fight. The posse moved out of Madelia in tight formation, hooves beating a steady rhythm on the packed earth of the road. As they neared the lower ground along the river, they slowed and began to use the landscape for cover. The flat fields gave way to more uneven land marked by stands of trees, patches of brush, and shallow draws that could hide a rider until the last moment. The men spoke little, saving their breath and keeping their attention on any sign of horses or recently broken vegetation. Tracks along the way showed fresh hoof prints and footprints that matched the boys' report. They saw where horses had been led off a road into softer ground and where someone had stumbled, leaving a deeper mark in the mud. Meanwhile, the fugitives had reached the slough and chosen a spot they believed to be defensible. The place where they halted lay in low ground near the Watonwan River, where water seeped into the soil and clusters of plum bushes grew thickly. The trees above were not tall, but they cast enough shadow to break up lines of sight. The men led their horses into the cover and tied them where they could keep some movement room. Then they settled themselves among the brush, arranging what ammunition they had left and checking their pistols and long guns. Cole surveyed the ground with the eye of someone who had seen plenty of fighting. The short distance between bushes, the soft footing, and the tangled branches would make it difficult for any attackers to charge quickly. The four men would be able to fire at close range before anyone reached them. On the other hand, there was little room to fall back if they were pressed, and their injuries meant they could not run if things went wrong. The slough was a place to stand or to die, not a place to slip away unseen. The waiting that followed weighed heavily on them. Every rustle in the brush or splash in the shallow water sounded louder than it should have. The air was cool but still, and faint insect noise carried clearly. Jim sat with his back against a low trunk, revolver across his lap, jaw throbbing with each heartbeat. Bob cleaned and checked his pistol more than once, working past the pain in his chest and shoulder. Pitts moved between positions, peering through gaps in the foliage toward the likely approaches. Cole kept his gaze moving, trying to guess from which direction the men of the countryside would come. Late in the morning, the first signs of their arrival appeared. Farther up the slope, the posse had dismounted and spread out, tying horses where they would be screened from immediate sight. Glispin ordered the men into a skirmish line, spacing them several yards apart so that a single volley from the outlaws could not strike more than one or two at a time. Rifles were brought up and revolvers were checked one more time. The sheriff gave clear instructions. Advance quietly, keep the line even, and at the first clear sight of the fugitives, demand a surrender before firing. The descent into the slough was cautious. Each man moved from tree to tree, pausing to listen and watch. Mud pulled at boots and branches tugged at clothing. They could not see one another constantly, but they knew from agreed spacing where the man to the left and right should be. The smell of wet plants in the river grew stronger as they neared the bottom. Somewhere ahead of them, hidden among the plum bushes, the four men they sought waited with firearms in their hands. When the two groups finally came within range of one another, the moment unfolded quickly. One of the posse men caught a flicker of movement, the shape of a hat or shoulder between leaves. He signaled softly. The line paused, then began to close again. At a range where faces could be made out through the foliage, Sheriff Glispin called out a demand that the fugitives show themselves and give up their weapons. His words carried firmly across the short distance, leaving no doubt about what he wanted. The reply came not in words, but in the sharp crack of gunfire. Charlie Pitts, unwilling to admit defeat, fired first. His shot came from low among the bushes and aimed toward the figure he believed to be the sheriff. The bullet either missed or only glanced, but it served as the signal for combat. Almost at once, guns roared from both sides. Muzzle flashes lit the shadows between the bushes. Smoke hung in the damp air, making it harder to see and easier to smell the burnt powder. The fight that followed lasted only a brief span of time, but every second inside it felt stretched and strained for the men involved. Pitts fired again and tried to shift position, but the posse's return fire was accurate and determined. One shot caught him in the body, another struck soon afterward. He tried to move, stumbled a few steps through the brush, and fell to the wet ground, where he did not rise again. The younger brothers also fired as best they could, but their injuries and the cramped quarters limited them. Cole, already carrying numerous wounds from Northfield and the long chase, took more bullets. One struck an arm, another a side, another a leg. Jim, whose jaw had been mangled earlier, was hit again in the body and limbs. Bob, who had been nursing a chest wound, felt another shot tear into him. Shots from their pistols still went out, but the strength behind them weakened as blood loss increased. On the posse's side, several men took grazing wounds and one was struck more seriously, but their injuries were not fatal. They kept up a steady fire, aiming toward any movement in the brush. The distance between the two lines shrank to only a few yards in places, close enough that men could hear one another grunt in pain and curse as they raised and lowered weapons. Branches snapped, and bits of bark flew where bullets struck trunks. At last, the imbalance of numbers, position, and condition showed itself clearly. Pitts lay dead. The younger brothers were bleeding heavily, finding it hard to lift their arms. The slough that had seemed like cover now felt more like a shallow bowl with no exit. Cole, hit in many places, forced himself to stay conscious, but the prospect of one more charge from the posse across the short space seemed impossible to meet. Bob, fighting to breathe, recognized that another minute of this would end in 3 dead brothers beside the man already lying still. The decision to stop came from Bob's lips. In a voice that strained his wounded chest, he called out that they would surrender. The words came amid the clatter of the last few shots, but they carried enough force to be heard. Glispin ordered his men to hold fire at once, warning them sharply not to shoot again unless the outlaws tried to resume resistance. The woods fell quiet except for the moans of the wounded and the rustle of movement as the posse adjusted its positions. Carefully, rifles still ready, the men of the posse advanced into the thicket where the gang had been hiding. They stepped over branches and pushed past bushes that still shook slightly from the earlier impacts. They found Charlie Pitts first, lying face down in the damp grass, his clothing torn and stained dark with blood. A quick check confirmed that he was dead. A short distance away, the 3 younger brothers sat or lay where they had fallen, weapons either dropped or set aside. Their faces were pale under grime and dried blood, and their clothes were riddled with holes and fresh stains that showed where new rounds had torn through flesh. Cole looked up at the approaching men with eyes that still held defiance despite the pain. Jim held a hand against one of his wounds, blood seeping between his fingers. Bob tried to straighten but could not quite manage it. The posse members disarmed them methodically, collecting pistols, knives, and any spare ammunition. Hands were bound, though care was taken not to tighten cords over the worst of the injuries. There was no need for harsh blows. The exhausted, shot-through men in front of them no longer had the strength to resist. A wagon was brought as close as the terrain allowed. Men hauled the wounded outlaws up the slope and laid them on blankets or whatever padding could be found in the wagon bed. As they were lifted, groans escaped the brothers despite any effort to stay silent. Each jolt of the wheels over uneven ground sent fresh pain along shattered bones and torn muscles. Pitts's body was handled separately, placed in a way that would allow transport back to town. The procession from Hanska Slough to Madelia drew eyes wherever it passed. Farmers paused in their fields to look at the wagon where 3 battered men lay under guard. Some removed their hats silently. Others pointed out the bandaged faces and soaked shirts to family members, explaining in low voices who these men were and what had happened in Northfield and along the road since. In Madelia itself, residents gathered along the street as word spread that the long chase had ended. The prisoners were taken to the Flanders Hotel, a solid brick structure that served as a makeshift holding place and infirmary. Doctors and local women moved in quickly with bandages, basins, and whatever medicines were available. Bullets had to be located and removed where possible. Wounds were cleaned roughly, sometimes without enough anesthetic to dull the pain fully. The brothers clenched their fists and teeth as knives and probes worked on them. At the same time, guards stood watch with loaded weapons posted outside doors and in hallways, unwilling to assume that even gravely wounded men could not cause trouble if left unwatched. By the time night fell on Madelia, lamps were burning in the rooms where the famous outlaws lay under close observation. Outside, men who had ridden in the posse talked through the events of the day in low, tired voices. The wet ground of Hanska Slough, the brief, violent exchange of shots, the sight of the prisoners being hoisted into the wagon, all of it was now part of a shared memory. In the wider region, telegraph wires began to carry new messages. The remaining members of the gang had been brought down in a marsh on the Watonwan River, 1 dead, 3 barely alive, and the long hunt that had occupied so many men and miles since the bank raid now had its endpoint in a small Minnesota town. September 23, 1876, crowds lined the streets of Faribault as wagons rolled in from Madelia with 3 chained prisoners who only weeks earlier had been feared from Missouri to Iowa. Cole Younger, Jim Younger, and Bob Younger rode under guard, their wounds bandaged, their clothes still marked by mud from Hanska Slough and dried blood from the running fight that had ended their freedom. People climbed onto fences and storefront steps to watch the wagons pass, some silent, some jeering, all wanting to see with their own eyes the men whose attempt to rob the First National Bank of Northfield had cost local lives but had ended in defeat. The Rice County Jail, a solid stone building, took them in under heavy guard, doors barred and iron keys turned as deputies checked and rechecked each lock. While the younger brothers settled into cells in Faribault, the town they had tried to break only a short ride away dealt with its dead. Joseph Lee Haywood lay in a coffin in his Northfield home on 3rd Street, his body washed and dressed by neighbors and church members who moved quietly through the rooms, aware that the man on the parlor stand had been the one who refused to open the bank safe even when guns were pressed into his face. Stores closed their doors as his funeral procession formed. Nearly 1,000 people came, farmers from the countryside, Carleton College faculty and students, local officials, veterans from the Union regiments that had supplied many of Northfield's fighting men. They filled the church and the area outside as the minister spoke about duty and conscience, about a quiet bank officer who had chosen to stand between armed criminals and the savings of a young community that had no insurance, no backup if that money vanished. At the cemetery south of town, men lowered Haywood's coffin into the ground, while his widow and daughter watched from beside the open grave. The mound of earth and the new marker became an early point of pilgrimage for residents who wanted a place to recognize what had happened on Division Street. Committees formed to support the family. Bankers and business people from across Minnesota and farther away sent contributions to provide for his wife and child, recognizing that his refusal inside the vault had protected not only a single institution but people's deposits and the stability of a college town still under construction. Carleton College created a fund in his name, a way to tie the future of its students to the memory of the man who had served as its treasurer and who had died guarding the resources that kept its doors open. 4 days after the shooting in the street, another funeral took place. Nicholas Gustafsson, the Swedish immigrant who had ridden into town that morning behind a team of mules, died from the head wound he had received when he failed to clear the street during the chaos. His English had been poor, his understanding of shouted commands limited, and he had simply tried to walk toward the bank while men on horses and on foot shouted for people to get out of the way. A bullet or a fragment had torn into his skull, and he had never fully regained awareness. When he died on September 11th, the Swedish community around Millersburg and the new farms near Northfield faced the loss of a relative newcomer who had hoped to build a life in the American Midwest. With no established cemetery of their own, they buried him in Northfield's ground, and his grave, too, became part of the story of that day. In the months that followed, his countrymen organized to build Christdala Lutheran Church and establish a cemetery near Circle Lake, a permanent mark of how one stray victim from the raid shaped the development of a small immigrant community. Back in Faribault, the legal machinery of Minnesota prepared to deal with the captured outlaws. Sheriffs from several counties conferred with the governor's office about security. Rumors spread that sympathizers from Missouri might try to break the prisoners out. The state responded by stationing extra guards, restricting access to the jail, and arranging for trusted lawmen to escort the youngers whenever they were moved. Reporters arrived from Minneapolis and St. Paul, some from farther away, filling hotel rooms and sending dispatches that described each hearing and each glimpse of the wounded prisoners. Citizens packed the courtroom whenever the case came up, filling benches, standing 3 deep along the walls, craning their necks to look at the 3 men in shackles whose names had filled wanted notices for years. On November 16, 1876, a Rice County grand jury issued 4 formal indictments. 2 charged the younger brothers with first-degree murder, 1 for the killing of Joseph Lee Haywood inside the bank, the other for the fatal wounding of Nicholas Gustafsson on the street. A 3rd indictment covered the attempted robbery of the First National Bank itself. naming the three brothers as part of the band that had entered Northfield with the intention of taking the bank's assets at gunpoint. The fourth accused them of assault with deadly weapons upon Alonzo Bunker, the bank teller who had been shot as he fled the building and who still carried scars from the bullet that had torn through his shoulder as he ran down Division Street. Prosecutors assembled eyewitnesses from the town, men and women who had seen the raiders ride in, watched the gunfight unfold, and in some cases had fired from windows or doorways themselves. Lawyers working with the defendants studied the evidence and the statutes of Minnesota. The state allowed capital punishment for first-degree murder, and two dead citizens stood at the center of the case, one a bank officer, the other an unarmed immigrant. There was no realistic prospect of an acquittal. The younger brothers had been captured in possession of weapons and stolen horses with fresh wounds that lawmen and doctors could tie to the gunfight in the swamp and the running pursuit that followed the raid. Word reached the defense team that public anger in Minnesota was intense and that a jury drawn from the region was very unlikely to show mercy if given a chance to decide between life and death. On November 20th, the three brothers appeared in court to enter their pleas. Spectators filled every seat. Cole, whose face still bore lines from pain and confinement, rose when asked and answered that he was guilty. Jim followed, his injury from Hanska Slough making each movement stiff. Bob, who had been the youngest and who carried a lung wound that made his breathing shallow, also answered that he was guilty. They admitted their role in the raid and accepted responsibility for the killings, a decision that removed the need for a lengthy trial and, as far as they understood it, avoided the gallows. The judge pronounced sentence: life imprisonment for each of them to be served at the state prison in Stillwater. 4 days later, heavily guarded wagons carried the Youngers from Faribault toward the prison on the St. Croix River. Guards rode alongside and behind, rifles ready. People gathered at crossings and small settlements along the route, some staring in silence, others shouting insults or calling out the names of Haywood and Gustafson. At Stillwater, thick stone walls and iron gates closed behind the prisoners. The staff processed them like any other long-term inmates, issuing striped uniforms, cropping hair, and assigning identification numbers. Medical staff examined their wounds, cleaned them again, and made clear that in this place they would be treated not as legendary raiders but as convicts expected to follow the rules of the institution. Prison life settled into a daily grind that bore no resemblance to the free movement and sudden violence that had defined their years as guerrillas and then as bank and train robbers. The younger brothers rose at the prison bell, ate in silence, and worked in assigned shops. Cole, whose literacy and habits made him stand out, became involved with a new prison newspaper, helping with its printing and organization, turning his attention from the saddle and the revolver to type, paper, and ink. Jim and Bob took on other tasks in the workshops and inside the walls. Guards kept a close eye on them, but over time the three men came to be known as steady workers who followed orders, in sharp contrast to the reputation they had carried when they arrived in Minnesota. Years passed and the outside world changed while the Youngers remained within the stone perimeter. Railroads multiplied, towns grew, and the image of the gang shifted in the public mind from immediate menace to subject of dime novels and local stories. In Minnesota, though, memories of Division Street and the bodies of Haywood and Gustafson kept the reality close. Northfield built new houses and businesses, the two colleges expanded, and the bank continued to operate in the same structure that had once held armed men demanding access to its vault. Bullet marks on stone and recorded testimony in county archives carried the details forward, while families told children about the day merchants grabbed shotguns and young men fired from windows to stop what had been planned as a quick one-sided crime. On September 16, 1889, the first of the imprisoned brothers died. Bob Younger, whose chest had been damaged in the Northfield fighting, and who had shown signs of tuberculosis, weakened to the point where doctors could do little more than ease his discomfort. In the prison hospital, under the watch of staff and with visits from his brothers, he succumbed to the disease. His body left Stillwater in a coffin carried back to Missouri for burial in the ground near the family's home. News accounts noted that the end had come not on a dusty street in a new raid, but in a prison ward. Far from the banks and trains he had once helped rob, the long reach of that September day in Northfield still visible in the fact that he had never again walked free after it. Public debate over the remaining Youngers continued into the new century. Some Minnesotans argued that Cole and Jim had served enough time and had behaved well behind bars, that they had accepted their punishment without escape attempts or disruption. Others insisted that the murders of Haywood and Gustafson and the wounds to other citizens could never be balanced by good conduct in prison, and that life sentences should mean exactly that. Petitions moved back and forth, legislative efforts appeared and stalled, and governors weighed the risk of appearing soft on infamous criminals against the growing distance in time from the original crime. In July 1901, after nearly 25 years behind the walls, Cole and Jim Younger were paroled. The decision came with conditions. They were required to remain within Minnesota, to report regularly to authorities, and to live within the limits imposed on paroled felons. The two men, older, marked by scars and years of confinement, stepped through the prison gates into a world that had electric lights, new factories, and different fashions on city streets. Supporters arranged employment, and for a brief time they experienced ordinary tasks, travel for work, and contact with communities that knew them as both former outlaws and men who had spent decades paying for their role in a single violent afternoon. Freedom did not bring peace for Jim. Old wounds troubled him, and his health remained fragile. He entered into a relationship with a woman he had met during his imprisonment, but legal limits tied to his parole blocked marriage. The combination of physical pain, restricted movement, and personal frustration pushed him into deep depression. On October 19, 1902, in a St. Paul hotel room, he took his own life. His death added another grave to the list of people whose lives had been shaped and shortened by a sequence of choices that had reached its crisis in a Minnesota bank and on the streets around it. His body was carried back to Missouri, where the Younger family plots continued to gather the remains of brothers who had followed similar paths and met hard endings. Cole Younger outlived them all. In February 1903, he received a full pardon from Minnesota, with the condition that he never again take up residence in the state. He left, returned to Missouri, and tried to build a final chapter that did not revolve around guns and flight. He joined Frank James for a time in a show that presented staged scenes from their earlier lives, a traveling performance that turned once lethal episodes into controlled demonstrations for paying crowds. Later, he turned to lecturing, describing crime as a road to suffering and loss, presenting himself as someone who had seen its consequences from both sides and now warned others against it. He wrote about his experiences, emphasizing some elements and omitting others, but never escaping the fact that his name remained tied in public memory to the raid on Northfield and the years of outlaw activity that led to it. He died in March 1916 in Lee's Summit, Missouri, a former guerrilla and bandit who had spent a quarter-century behind Minnesota Stone for a bank robbery that failed. While the Younger brothers sat in cells or lay in graves, the two men who had escaped Minnesota on horseback faced their own long aftermath. Frank and Jesse James had separated from the rest of the gang after the failure at Northfield, and had ridden hard across southern Minnesota and into territory farther west before turning south. For a time, they disappeared from public view, living under assumed names in Tennessee, trying to keep a low profile while the intensity of the search in the upper Midwest eased. The group that had once been called the James Younger Gang no longer existed. Missouri still held sympathizers, and in some communities the brothers remained figures of admiration. But the days of riding with a tight band of veterans from the guerrilla war had ended in the fields and sloughs of Minnesota. In the late 1870s and early 1880s, Jesse returned to robbery, organizing new men for train and bank holdups in southern states. The recruits lacked the shared war background that had bound the original group together, and loyalty proved thinner. Law enforcement pressure increased, and large rewards for Jesse's capture or death tempted those around him. On April 3, 1882, inside a house in St. Joseph, Missouri, Jesse stood on a chair to straighten a picture on the wall. Robert Ford, a member of his current group, fired a shot into the back of his head, ending the life of a man who had begun as a teenage guerrilla and had become a symbol of post-war outlawry. His death removed the last active field leader tied to the raid on Northfield. Frank James surrendered to authorities later that year, stood trial in Missouri and Alabama, and was acquitted. He spent his remaining decades in quieter roles, working as a ticket seller, a lecturer, and a farmhand, his name still recognizable, but his days of riding with guns behind a mask or hat brim long finished. Back in Northfield, the memory of the raid settled into the town's identity in ways both formal and personal. The First National Bank continued to operate, and the building later became the home of the local historical society. Inside, exhibits displayed the vault door, photographs of the participants, weapons recovered from the robbers, and maps showing where citizens had taken up positions during the gunfight. Outside, markers indicated bullet scars in the stone and pointed visitors toward the spots where Clell Miller and Bill Chadwell had fallen, and where wounded townspeople had sought help. Families told stories about ancestors who fired from upstairs windows, handed ammunition to defenders, or dragged wounded men out of the street. Each year, residents and visitors walked to the cemetery where Joseph Lee Haywood and Nicholas Gustafson lay. Memorial services honored them as the two civilians who had died in direct connection with the raid, one inside the bank, one on the street. Speakers described Haywood's refusal to open the safe and Gustafson's inability to understand shouted warnings. Tying their fates to broader themes of duty and the hazards faced by immigrants trying to find their place in a new land. The graves, simple in design, served as reminders that a single afternoon of violence had consequences that extended outward into families, churches, and schools. By the middle of the 20th century, Northfield's response to the raid had taken on the structure of an annual celebration. Residents established defeat of Jesse James Days as a festival held each year near the date of the robbery. Parades, reenactments of the gunfight on Division Street, and public ceremonies connected modern crowds to the 19th century event. Volunteers dressed in clothing styled after the 1870s rode horses past the old bank building and restaged key moments of the raid, including the shout that the bank was being robbed, the rush of armed citizens into the street, and the retreat of the surviving outlaws under fire. The festival emphasized that in this town the story ended not with bandits riding away unchallenged, but with local people standing in doorways, leaning from windows, and taking direct action to stop a crime. Across the American West, the failed robbery in Minnesota stood out as a turning point. It demonstrated that towns linked to railroads and telegraph lines, populated by veterans who still owned their rifles and revolvers, would not always freeze in fear when notorious men appeared. In earlier years, gangs had ridden into isolated communities, taken what they wanted, and disappeared before news could spread. Northfield showed that a place with alert citizens and a willingness to use available weapons could transform a carefully planned raid into a disaster for the criminals. The deaths of 2 gang members in the street, the serious wounds to 3 others, the later capture at Hanska Slough, and the long sentences in Stillwater illustrated that the risks of such raids had grown. The James Younger gang never again rode together after September 7, 1876. Some members died quickly, others slowly, some in gunfire, others in prison infirmaries or quiet rooms far from the sound of hooves and gunshots. Northfield and the farms and churches around it continued to grow, shaped in small and large ways by the people who had stepped forward when outlaws tried to take control of their streets. The bank vault Haywood defended protected the town's savings. The colleges continued to educate students, and the story of that afternoon passed from eyewitnesses to documents, from documents to museum exhibits, and from there into the understanding of anyone who walked through the town and looked up at the stone building on Division Street where a robbery had gone wrong because ordinary citizens refused to stand aside.